My notebook. Here it is.
Here we are, the Libertarian
again,
Moms on Thursday, season 4, getting ready for Valentine's Day. Tonight's episode, sharing is caring, but you shouldn't have to do it. And we'll just let you ruminate on that for just a second or so as we jump through the hoops, Get ready. We're the Libertarian Moms. It's showtime. Link to the show notes in the blog or in the comments section here for those of you that are watching live. Welcome, Jessica, Melissa. Happy Thursday to you.
Indeed, it's almost Friday.
It's almost Friday. This is Jessica's bag, our Valentine's episode. So get us kicked off. What are we talking about tonight and why are we talking about it?
Tonight we're talking about forced sharing. Forcing our children to share from very early age. It's something that that I've noticed in motherhood and my interactions with other mothers and with my children and their friends that a lot of parents, expect their children to share, force their children to share. And so tonight I think we wanted to talk about, why it's important to teach your children to be generous and instill that generosity in them, but also teaching them that it's okay if you don't really want to share either. And that, it's something that we shouldn't force our children to do, because I think naturally humans are generous by nature. And if we let that happen naturally, I think it's a little more valuable. So.
Yeah, the idea for this came up as we were talking about what do we want to talk about around Valentine's Day, right? And typically you get a couple of moms together and what are we going to talk about on Valentine's Day? I don't know. Honestly, like Valentine's not a big deal at our house, quite frankly. But there's this should there be gifts? Should there be cards? Should it even be a holiday? Blah, 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 blah. But I like the idea that we go back to this elementary school practice of having to write out Valentines. You get the class list. Every kid has to give a Valentine to everybody. And you're really sending your kid off to school hoping that this is going to be a fun time, that they're going to be able to just enjoy each other and eat some candy and like hearts and, flowers and whatever. And like, it's all fine. But there's this sort of insidious underneath thing where everybody has to be included, everybody has to be liked, everybody has to be the same, everybody has to be equal, which sort of sours the whole experience too. And so then Jessica built on this with this idea of like, it's just like when we're in play circles and we try to manage the kids' behavior with one another and we try to force them to do what we think a kid well beyond their years of experience and understanding would do. And we want them to act like little grown-ups and we want them to be polite to one another and we want to be proud of them for sharing their toys. And I think it's more about us than it is about them at that point. And Melissa, you made a good point before we came on the air. Talk about the developmental stages here and like, what do they really have an understanding of at 3, 4, 5 years old?
Well, Jessica was saying that kids don't understand the concept of sharing until they're 4 or 5 years old. So my 2-year-old will share because she has no concept of ownership. She does not understand that that thing belongs to her. So if you want it, sure, you can have it. But that's not sharing. It's physically sharing. But in her mind, that she's not sharing that. It's just you want that thing. She has no claim to that thing because she doesn't understand ownership. So she can't share if she doesn't understand that someone can own something.
So then when we start trying to force them to share, so I have something that you want, and then it's said to me like, give it to her, share it with her. And I'm like, well, wait a second, but why? I don't really understand the concept of that. And that's where this whole thing comes from, right, Jessica? I mean, like parents feel compelled to make their kid behave and make their kid be kind. But the argument here is this is not the right way to do it.
Yeah. And I think it's because you're teaching them a lot of things that are actually contrary to probably what you're hoping to teach them, right? You're teaching them things like that their consent is not important, that they don't have a say in the matter. And for instance, if your son has, like, let's say my son has a brand new toy and he purchased it. Let's say he worked for weeks, he did extra chores, he got this money so that he could buy this toy he wanted. And he has a friend that he's playing with, and that friend wants to play with the toy, but he knows this friend is generally destructive. If I tell him, you have to let your friend play with that toy, then that tells him that all of his hard work and his consent to share his property is not important, right? So I think that's an important piece of it. And then a few other things that I put in the notes are things like the child's not being given the opportunity to benefit from the positive feelings that come with being generous, being naturally generous, right? Like, you do something for someone, you don't do it for recognition and you don't do it to feel good. But I think there is some positive mental benefit to doing good for other people. I think naturally you're going to feel better about yourself. You're going to feel good about that, right? And then the kid might think that if they don't do this thing, because if you're telling them that, you have to share, that it's not good not to share, they might start to think they're a bad kid, Like, I mean, I could see a kid thinking, well, if I don't do this, that means I'm bad, right? Because sharing is
or
good.
even if I don't want to share, if I have
Right.
feelings that I don't want to share, something must be wrong with me
Yeah.
because I should want to do this thing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And then there's the idea of ownership, which, Melissa, is also what you mentioned, and it's teaching children that they're not allowed to have an opinion. They're not allowed to have control over their property, right? And I definitely don't think that's a lesson we want to teach our kids, because we want to teach them that they do have control over their property, and then how to be good stewards, right? How to use their property in a way that is good for them, but also good for the community around them, ultimately.
So imagine so Holly's an only child. And as we are expecting friends to come and visit, some of the conversations we would have before those friends would come and visit is, what do you think you're going to do with these new children who are coming into the home? What kinds of toys would you like to share with them? What kinds of games would you like to play with them? And it would be through this, like, let's go through what you currently have. And if there's anything in here that you are worried it might get broken, or you don't want to share it with somebody else, let's put that away. So it's not even here and it's not even available to them, right? If you want to use your Switch while they're here, you should expect to share that Switch with them. You should expect to let them play with that game. And if you don't want them to play with that game, then you don't need to have that out around them. They're our guests and we want to treat them fairly, right? And so there was some of that, like, preparing before they ever even came over to make sure that we just, like, avoided that confrontational piece altogether. And then there were times when people would ask to use things that Holly had. And again, because she's not used to sharing, there aren't any siblings in the house that we would, just try to beat it into her. You've got to share your stuff. Like, she doesn't have to do that, right? And so anytime that there were conflicts, right, then it would be, if you don't want to share that with our neighbor, right, who is here playing, then you either don't play with it or the neighbor goes home. But that's it. You can't sit in the room playing with it and let the neighbor sit there and watch you play with it. That's not kind.
Right.
Yeah, like, it's not kind. It's not considerate. Like,
It's rude.
if you,
Yeah.
it's rude. And so it was that, like, it's fine if you don't want to share it, but what that means is your friend is going home, because I'm not going to make you share it with her, but at the same time, you're not going to play with it in front of her and refuse to share it. That's not kind behavior. It's not compassionate behavior. So I think there's ways to be sort of reasonable about those conversations, and it's not, forcing her to give up something that is her possession.
Yeah, a big part of that is having those little discussions all throughout the day and the years, instead of calling them out in the moment in front of people and embarrassing them and making them feel bad. Like, you have those discussions beforehand and after the fact, and you say, well, what could you have done? Or what are we going to do?
Well, or to your exact point, like, or letting my embarrassment rule that moment, right? When the parent says, well, Holly, you should share with Jack or whatever. and me go, yeah, Holly, you should share, because I'm embarrassed that Holly's not doing what this other person has requested that she do,
Yep.
right? Instead of standing up for Holly and going, well, actually, that's Holly's toy, and if she doesn't want to share, she doesn't have to. But I will make her put it away so that Jack doesn't feel like he's being denied, right? Like that's because it's just not fair, right? Or it's not a
that's the rule in our house with multiple children. They all have their own rooms. And I have children that will leave things in the living room and then get mad that other children are touching them. If it's that important to you, you need to keep it in your bedroom.
Room. Yep.
Because your bedroom is your space. No one's going to go in there and take your toys. If this toy is something you don't want to share, put it in your space, and I will back you 1,000%. But if you leave it sitting on the floor of the living room and your sibling picks it up,
it's fair game.
You obviously don't care that much. You left it sitting in the living room.
Yeah.
This is multiple children problems.
Well, I was going to ask you about that, though, because you don't force the siblings to share with one another.
Unless it's something I have specifically. The Switch. You mentioned the Switch. We got the Switch one year. It was the birthday present because it's so expensive for all three of them. I told them all, I bought it. And I said, y'all, this is all of y'all's. So they have to share that because it doesn't belong to any of them. But but there's personal toys. You don't have to share. It's not, and I'm not going to defend you if your sister gets mad at you. If she's mad at you because you won't share, y'all have to work that out. I'm not getting involved.
You know what? I think it's interesting though. I'm gonna, because I'm looking at like who's watching and are they watching? Is my family watching? I think it's interesting that like once we start cohabitating with one another, what do we share, right? When Charlie and I first moved in together, we had this like collective shelf of t-shirts. They're just t-shirts, right? They're all the same size. Some of them in better condition than others, right? Like some were our favorites or whatever, but they're all just t-shirts. So they all just got folded together. They all just got put on the shelf, no problem. And over the years, they have been separated out to like his shelf of t-shirts and my shelf of t-shirts as we have like thrown some away and gotten some new ones or whatever. And there's little things like coffee mugs that we have that are, that my favorite mugs versus his favorite mugs, they all go into the same coffee mug cabinet. But if I come downstairs and I go to grab my mug and I can't use it because he's using it, like I get a little sense of like, but I really wanted to use that mug. Like at what point do we kind of recognize it like property ownership rights and like I have a right to feel like I have first access to that? But then I'm expected to go, well, it's okay because it's a coffee mug. It's not that big a deal.
No, it's not just a cup. No, absolutely not. Nope.
Oh,
talk us off the ledge, Jessica.
Nope. I've got
my Tervises. Right. I get mad when they're all dirty and I have to use my husband.
You can ask Michael Etheridge. He'll tell you it will be war if you use my coffee mug. Nope. My coffee mug is my coffee mug. It's off limits. But we also have a rule in our house, like our kids are not allowed to come into our bedroom without being invited or having permission. And generally, we don't just bust into their rooms unless we knock and get permission to come in. We always try to be respectful of each other's space. And so I think that's an example of that, teaching them that, it's important to be respectful and mindful of that. And I think they do a really good job of that too. Like Jackson will knock or announce himself and make sure it's okay for him to come into Caldwell's room, and Caldwell does the same.
We'll call it being good roommates, right? So there are things that we do for one another because we're good roommates. We unload the dishwasher when it needs to be done. We take out the trash when it needs to be done. We don't wait for somebody to tell us to do it. We do it because it needs to be done because we're good roommates, right? Like that's the idea is like, here's how we have our collective, our shared spaces. Charlie's mom was funny about it one time. She came over and we call them our common areas, the living room, the kitchen, the places where we all have to, we all inhabit. And keep, policing that, making sure you're not leaving, dirty Kleenex and empty glasses and these kinds of things. Like these are our common spaces that we all share. And like, let's be respectful of the fact that other people are moving in this space as well. If you want to have a pile of dirty, Kleenex on your bed, that's your problem, right? But we're not going to do it in our in our common areas. And just having that vocabulary for it has created, hopefully, a little bit more respect as far as that's concerned. I love that you don't just bust into your kids' rooms. I remember growing up that way with my parents having a lot of respect for your personal space and saying, okay, this is now yours. At what point do you figure that out? All right.
Now, I will say, when my boys were little, though, they did the first until Jackson was, I don't know, I guess he was probably 6 or 7, maybe. And they actually did share a bedroom. And we had, instead of having them in separate bedrooms, they shared a bedroom, and then they had a playroom. And so all of their toys went into the playroom. And then they each had like a set of drawers in the closet for their toys, like the things that were theirs specifically. And they didn't, but we had like a community space that they could play. All of the toys were together. And then now that because they have different interests as they get older, so now they have their own rooms. But yeah.
Well, Charlie and his brother shared a room until he went to college. And then
my brother and I shared a room.
Yeah, and then Charlie had he went to college, he had a roommate, right? And it wasn't really until he was living on his own off campus that he had his own space. And that didn't last long because eventually he moved in with me, right? So there may be for Charlie like 5 years in his life where he had his own space. And even now I have my office. I'm in my office now. Like this is my own space.
That's good. You want that in a husband.
Yeah, I know. Bless Hardy's on the couch, like doing all of his studying, like with no personal space of his own. But all that to say, right? Like when you grow up without it, is there more respect for it? And then do you try to protect it and preserve it for others? And one of the things we didn't do in last week's episode that I like after we hung up, I was like, is we didn't necessarily pull it back to the libertarian piece, right? To like, what does this have to do with being libertarians? And so I thought you did a good job with this in the show notes, and I'm going to throw that website up there again real quick, the Parenting Porcupines piece. But like, Jessica, talk a little bit about this idea of sharing is generosity, but only if it's not forced. And what does this mean in relationship to our government and taxation and those kinds of things?
Yeah, well, I mean, if generosity is voluntary, right? And so if you're being forced to be generous, you're not being generous, right? So I think that there are a lot of examples of that within our government. I mean, obviously, taxation is the one that we can probably use as the biggest example because we don't really consent to that. I mean, we're born paying taxes, right? But I mean, those things fund they fund other things like entitlement programs, more specifically, and these are the things that they use to justify paying these taxes. Like you'll hear people say, well, we have to help others. We have to use this to help with this thing, or to provide health care to this group of people, or to feed this group of people, or to provide childcare for this group of people. And they do that because as humans, we want to be generous, right? But there's a difference between assessing what you have and determining what you need and what you have as a surplus, and then sharing that, being generous with that, right? And then being told that this is what you need. So this is what you have that's extra, and we're going to take this extra, and then we're going to give it to these people that we think are in need. Like, you don't get to choose what you support, what causes you support. We're going to do that for you. And that's what this is going to look like, this thing or that thing. And so I think that this kind of comes back to that, or it definitely comes back to that idea that teaching our children that they have to share because that's the rule, as opposed to being voluntarily generous. I think it sets them up to be just a sheep, one of the sheep, right? So
nobody wants a sheep. We're not raising sheep.
We're
raising porcupines.
Yeah.
But so I think you make a good point though. There's two pieces of this. The one side is there's evidence that Americans are extraordinarily generous, right? When
Yes,
asked to raise
absolutely.
money for anything, that money is overwhelmingly, it's there, right? Like we see it in a number of causes. When it's a cause that is valuable to
If there's a
anybody's,
natural disaster
Yeah.
in another country, the private donations from Americans
it is
They far,
over
I mean,
the
it
way
is.
people would
surpass
give away their money.
anything the
Mhm.
government
They
does.
will.
Yep.
Yeah.
So there's not a whole lot of, I don't think, evidence to show that if there's a demonstrated need, people will not come forward and fill that need. I think instead we've created this sort of default of, well, the government's going to take care of it. And because the government takes so much from me
They already
to
take my
take
money. I'm
care of it,
paying for it.
Yeah,
I
they're going to
can't
handle
afford
it.
to give anymore.
Yeah.
There's not anything left for me to be generous with.
Mhm.
And so now I have to expect that the government's going to be a good steward of my money. And we know that's not true. We know
Right.
that for all the decades that we've been fighting the war on poverty, we still have the exact same ratio of citizens in poverty, right? So these programs do not work. And there may be anecdotal evidence of individuals who have benefited from them, but across the board, this is a failed political strategy, right? And a failed
Yeah.
governmental strategy. And
Mhm.
yet we're still shoving money at them as if that's the only way to do good things in society, when we've seen evidence that if you simply create a program that demonstrates a need, people will be unfailingly generous to fulfill that need. So I mean, I'm really surprised that we
Especially
can.
now with the internet and
Oh, yeah, for
GoFundMe and
sure.
platforms
And the
like that.
visibility that people have, yeah. I mean, my God, the stupid
It's
ice bucket
ridiculous.
challenge where people were pouring ice on
Oh,
their
yeah.
heads and giving money for the benefit, like for no good reason. You know what I'm saying?
Mhm.
Like it was just fun. Let's play a game and let's give some money. Like, I mean, there's people are stupid generous when you ask them to be, but the more that this central planning idea takes over and the coercion exists, the fewer resources we have available to be generous with. And I think that's really the it starts early. It
Yeah.
starts early where you teach people that sharing is the right thing to do, whether you want to do it
Sharing
or
is
not.
caring, baby. Sharing is caring. Right? That's a slogan for something. I've
For
heard that.
something.
I've
I
heard
don't
it
know
For
too.
for what.
something.
I've heard that somewhere. Sharing is
For
caring.
something. It's also rhyming. Maybe it's a poem.
Well, and we've talked a lot about in prior episodes, and several of our prior episodes, and there are links to some of them in the show notes, but we've talked about in championing for a free society, right? And this libertarian utopia that we all want to live in. Because it is possible. I mean, it is possible, right? If we all make it happen. But you have to be willing to extend the same liberty to others that you want to have, right? That is something that we've talked
Yes.
about a lot. And you have to trust that in giving them that liberty, they're going to do the right thing. And I think that translates to our kids, right? Because if we teach them this idea, this principle of being generous and how important it is to be generous, and we instill that in them, and then we give them the freedom to exercise generosity and be generous how they see fit, then it's going to empower them to be more generous, right? It's going
Yep.
to perpetuate that cycle of generosity in our children. And I think that when you tell them that this is what sharing has to look like, I think that you're almost stifling that natural generosity that builds as you do good things, as you share what you have, right?
And I think building or planting the seeds of resentment in terms of people feeling like sharing was a negative experience for them, right? I didn't
Mhm.
get what I wanted because I had to share, right? This is 21 years we've been married and I've never had the pizza I wanted. I mean, just saying, right? Like,
Yeah.
because I always have to share with Charlie. We always get the pizza that is the compromise pizza, right? And so
Mm.
it's a whole joke. He's watching. It's a joke. But the idea that we always say like marriage is never having the pizza you actually want, right? Because you're going to get like, we're going to compromise on which toppings we want on the pizza. He gets 2 of his, I get 2 of mine, but that's not the pizza we actually want. I think the idea of creating of coercion, forcing people to do anything, is the beginning of the resentment over that, right? Like, I resent having to do this. If we had the means by which we could get 2 pizzas, let's just do that. You get your pizza, I'll get my pizza, and then I won't have to eat sausage on my pizza, right? And I think the same thing is true with kids. Like, if we are giving them the freedom to make these choices, they're going to want to love their friends and show their friends how much they love them. And that's part of that generosity of sharing. They're also going to have a sense of ownership of the things that are their own, and feel proud of the things that are their own, and want to protect those things and not want to risk them being broken. And so all of those sort of very responsible, very adult emotional responses to things is way better than being like, you have to share because I said so. And the kid being like, sharing sucks, like, they say it's caring, but it sucks, right?
Well,
Yeah.
as an adult, if someone came and said you have to share your car when you're not using it, or you have to share your lunch every day with someone who didn't bring one, that's bullshit. No, I'm not sharing my car because you don't have one. It's my car. Like, as
if you need a
adults, we
ride, ask
don't.
me. I mean, I'll come get
Yeah,
you and take you where you need to go.
yes, but you have to share this thing you own just because you have to share.
Just because you have it and
not an
somebody else
argument.
doesn't.
Yeah, that's not a valid argument.
That's so funny that you say that about the car, because I like, it's absurd to think that like Charlie would look at me and be like, you have to share your car with our neighbors because they don't have one. I'd be like, the fuck, man? Like, I'm sorry they don't have one, but like,
The
No,
hell
I
I
don't.
do.
Yeah,
right? But it's pretty much
it's
the
the
same thing. Like, I own that
thing.
car, I pay for that car, and the risk to
That's
me
my
of them
car.
driving it is
Yeah.
big, right? Versus like Holly's Switch, right? She paid for it, she owns it. If a kid comes over and I say you have to share that with that kid, the look on her face is like,
It's
are you kidding? This is
Yeah,
a $500 toy and I paid
yeah.
for it. I'm not giving it to this kid who could slam it on the ground. Like, come on, mom. I mean, it makes perfect sense that she would have a same sense of ownership there. But we go back to that earlier conversation about the little kids who don't really know what property rights are. And so when you tell them that they have to share, you're suspending how long it takes them to understand what property rights are. And that when they do start to feel possessive of something because it is theirs, then they feel guilty about feeling possessive of something, and they shouldn't. Right? There's no reason to feel guilty about the things that belong to you. So yeah, I think this whole purpose of the force kids to share thing has got all kinds of deep seated unpack that shit in therapy stuff.
Yeah, for sure, for sure. And all of these things, we talk a lot about cooperation and we talk a lot about accountability and personal responsibility. And when you put all of those things together with generosity and the non-aggression principle, which we've also covered, I think we covered that in season 1. But these are all like the building blocks of what we call voluntarism, right? And voluntarism is this idea that communities can self-regulate in order to be free of state control. It's a rejection of state control, and that these community members can self-regulate amongst themselves to establish a successful community, right? And that everyone can be successful by this cooperative type living and taking care of each other and taking care of yourselves and doing the right thing. And I think that teaching our children those principles will lead them to ultimately be this good person who is generous and kind, right?
But it's not even about being a good person. It's about them being polite. And those forced play behaviors, whether it is share your toy, whether it is say your prayer, whether it is whatever those forced play behaviors are a whole lot more about mom and how she feels about the kid's behavior than they are about how whether or not the kid is interacting in a proper and happy and healthy way, right?
Yeah.
Jessica, we lost your mic just a little bit. I don't know if it was in your earphone, but just now as we were listening to you, it sounded a little bit quieter than it had been before. But it's cool because we're towards the end here, and you rocked it on our notes for today's episode. And I think this being your pet thing, right? Like, I'll let you have the last word here. Sharing is caring, but you shouldn't have to do it. What should you do instead, Jessica?
Teach your children to be kind. Teach your children to be generous. Teach your children to be cooperative and exercise reasonable judgment. And I think that the generosity comes with all of those things. I think that when children are empowered to be good, they do good. Right? When they're empowered to do good, they do good. So
I'll agree with that.
You're trying to raise functioning adults, not children who don't embarrass you.
Yeah.
Oh, there's your mic. It's back. Yeah. We're trying to raise functioning adults. Absolutely. 100%. And sharing is not in and of itself a virtue. It's a demonstration of generosity. And until your kids learn what generosity is, forcing them to share doesn't force them to be generous. So
No.
I think that's probably the right place to end there. Thanks, ladies. We'll see y'all next.
Thanks,
Well,
y'all.
actually, we're taking next week off, but we'll be back in 2 weeks. Thanks for being with us on season 4 of Parenting Porcupines with the Libertarian Moms.
Casey,
ahead,
do we
Jess.
want to tell everybody about Saturday? The SCLP, if you're in South Carolina, we are going to caravan down to Somerville, to Middleton and Maker. A guy named Elliot Middleton
Awendaw.
in Awendaw, outside of Charleston. A guy named Elliot Middleton has this amazing operation where he collects donated cars, 100% donated cars. He repairs these cars and gives them away for free to people in need, people who don't have vehicles. And he funds this with a barbecue joint that he runs. And apparently they have some of the best barbecue in South Carolina. That's what I'm told.
Mm-hmm.
So the South Carolina Libertarian Party, a lot of us are going to go down on Saturday. We're going to go down and eat some barbecue and make some donations and support his cause. You know, what he's doing down there voluntarily, being so generous. Good job, Elliot. We're proud of you.
Yeah,
I
we're
don't know
proud
if
of you,
you've
Elliot.
seen. I don't know if I'm assuming they're all over the state, but all over Charleston. Okay, good night. I've seen billboards mentioning
We've come to the point in the show where one of Melissa's kids comes in to say goodnight.
It happens every time.
I feel like we almost got off the air without that happening. It's cool. Look, if you're interested in going down to Awendaw and supporting this voluntary effort to show support to somebody who's out there just doing good work in the community, not because he's getting paid to do it, not because it's a tax benefit, not because the government is coercing him into it, go out to sclp.org and look at the events. You can get all the details there. You can register. It's free to register, but we're just trying to get a head count ahead of time so that we know who's going to be there and we can let them know who to expect. Get some good barbecue here in South Carolina and support a good cause. So yeah, thanks, Jessica, for the reminder on that. This has been the Libertarian Moms. We will see you in 2 weeks.